Hey, YouTube, Twitter, and all our science friends out there. We got a special two-part episode coming at you this month where we chat with Scott Farling and Andy Schroeder of Ocean Plastics Recovery Project. In this first part, we'll talk about the origin of OPR and the core components of their project. And then stay tuned later in the month of part two, where we go deeper into the discussion of the types of plastic OPR recovers from Alaska's marine ecosystems and what they do with it. So can you all discuss how OPR was conceived and go into greater detail about the multidisciplinary work you all do?
I was a kayak guide in my 20s. I'm going way back now, I guess. Just noticed all the time on beaches that were supposed to be remote and pristine and that obviously nobody had been to in a long time, just that there was ocean, plastics everywhere. Around the same time, I had kind of this point in my career when I figured I couldn't be a kayaking guide forever. And one of my outlets for my creative energy after the Coast Guard was to found a nonprofit. I called it Island Trails Network, and we had a mission to develop, maintain, and promote trails, but we included trails broadly to include land and water trails. We're an island community here in Kodiak. I don't know if you're familiar with it. So there's a trail network that ITN maintains, and we build trails and get stoked about all that. But so many of our trails begin and end at the sea that I thought this was a good way to address what I came to find was called marine debris. These things that wind up that are in the ocean or in the coastal zone that don't belong there. Man-made objects, and they can be accidentally or intentionally discarded. It doesn't matter how they got there, but they're there. And we call that marine debris, and this new nonprofit, we decided to kind of make part of our stewardship of our water trails. We would clean up these beaches and make it go away. There was a grant. There were grants available for that, and I started with a small one from the Center for Alaskan Coastal Studies to just help clean up a local beach, and 40 people turned out, and we ended up picking up nearly a ton of marine debris. And that was the beginning of Island Trails Network's Marine Debris Program, which is now 12 years old, in its 13th year, I think. We consistently, work with grants. Right now, we're working under a grant from NOAA, just finishing up a grant. That's the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. We have a grant from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. And we use volunteers. It's the same as it has always been. We use volunteers. If we really want to score big and get a lot and find where the plastics really accumulate and pile up, we get off the road system. It means we go out in boats around the archipelago and employ volunteers to pick it up. And so even with with one boat and half a dozen volunteers, we pick up thousands of pounds a day. Sometimes it varies a little bit depending on how rich the pickings are. But I've been doing that for quite a long time now, a good portion of my life, and I never seem to run out of ocean plastics. And there's always a new coastline to clean up, and it's discouraging in some ways that it keeps showing up and that there's so much of it. But it also feels good to do something like this and to completely turn a place around by removing the human kind of footprint on it. So all that was well and good, and I was happily doing cleanups and shipping it off to China until around 2014. Right around then, there was something called Operation Green Fence, I think, and then a couple of years later, National Sword. But this was China cracking down on the imports of solid waste, and Scott knows quite a bit more about the regulatory climate than me, but he's familiar with it too. It killed the market for my recyclables, and I no longer had anywhere to send my marine debris. And I hated the prospect of canceling a cleanup and saying we can't do this anymore because we can't put it in our landfill. Our landfill's not designed for the ocean's waste, for our little town, and I have nowhere to send it. And so I decided to sort of, one, look into opportunities to recycle it and derive value from it or do something interesting with it. For a while, it was, I thought maybe 3D printing would get big and that we would turn it into filament. But, a series of false starts, and I came to realize that we don't have the infrastructure in the United States to recycle plastic. Without China's markets, I had nowhere to send it. And I just continued my cleanups, but I was hoarding stuff. And which is not doesn't give you a good feeling at night when you are cleaning up tons of trash a day and just dumping it in your yard, which we luckily have the Coast Guard leased us an acre of land, fenced it in, and we store it in big bulk bags there. I don't know how long we've been working together, but 2 years, it seems, a little bit, right? The summer of 2018, I think more specifically. I met Scott, a mutual friend, and Scott had ideas about recycling and creating markets and demands and finding a home for this stuff. And right away, we became friends and hatched this idea for the Ocean Plastics Recovery Project. And so it's a little longer than usual, but Scott, why don't you take it from there?
Yeah, I guess when I was first introduced to Andy, I thought I could point him to some folks that could help. I'd heard of, I've been working in recycling for over a decade now, and I thought I could point him in the direction of folks that were working with ocean plastics. But as we reached out to different companies, we learned that most of them are working with ocean-bound materials. Very few have been successful at processing materials that came out of the ocean or off the coastline. And so after consulting with a number of folks in the industry, both in the plastics industry and in the recycling industry, we decided it was a worthwhile pursuit to kind of put together a research program to determine what the best and highest use of these materials that we collect would be. And so that's how we got started, really working together. We partnered with Oregon State University, Purdue University, and Western Washington University to look at different forms of recycling, whether it was mechanical, chemical, or conversion technologies. And then we started partnering with companies as well, either companies that had a unique process that might be suitable for ocean plastics, or companies that were interested in helping solve the problem and would help fund some of our research. And that's really where we got started. And we've been growing that piece of our organization now for a couple of years, and have our first NOAA grant under OPR, or the Ocean Plastics Recovery Project, that we were awarded this past summer. And we're working on our next one already. And we're excited that every day it seems like we have new partners joining us to help us solve this problem.
How much marine debris do you recover in a day or a month or a year? And what types of plastic do you commonly encounter? And do you observe any impacts on wildlife?
It varies, of course. Long days in June, we tend to grind out longer hours, but we work in September, and then it's pretty much every daylight hour on the beach, getting what you can. The numbers range from probably 1,500 pounds in a day to up to 10,000 pounds. In the years after the Japan tsunami, we got an injection of funding that allowed us to scale up our vessel-based cleanup projects like never before. All of a sudden, but instead of pickup trucks and skips, now we're using bigger ships, helicopters, and barges, and slinging super sacks off the beach. And it was really cool to assemble a crew, from not 6 now but 12, and go to where the tsunami debris was, and in fact, which really is just where all the debris is. I mean, the tsunami, it was just blended into the normal circulation of ocean plastics. And in fact, I don't even think it increased it all that much. I think it was a blip on the radar screen of what's out there. We saw, we did see certain different new things show up during the tsunami, but really the overall tonnage, the overall picture didn't change much, and it hasn't changed much since the tsunami. It still continues to come in the same huge amounts. But to your question, 10,000 pounds a day is what we accomplished at Kayak Island in 2014, 15, and 16. I want to go back there. I want to go there are a few other places in Alaska like that where you can put a dozen people on the beach and just find huge, deposits of ocean plastic. And, if you pick up a 55-gallon barrel of high-density polyethylene, well, it's just one piece of litter, and nothing's going to swallow it right now. But, you got to think, you are removing, how many polymers are you removing from the ocean? Because eventually they're just going to get smaller and smaller and end up, in a very small scale, particle size being ingested into the food web and ending up in us.
It really struck me on my first cleanup with Andy, where you're working your way down a beach picking up materials, and all of a sudden you grab a 5-gallon bucket, and 5-gallon buckets weigh roughly about 2 pounds. And normally you can pick up a 5-gallon bucket in a couple seconds and have it in the sack and be on to your next piece. But every now and then you grab one, and it's so fragile because it's been in the environment so long and it's become degraded that it just crumbles into hundreds of pieces. And now all of a sudden that one bucket, that 2 pounds of plastic can take you hours to pick up because it's just little tiny fragments. And so capturing it now while it's there in its whole form, and while it has better opportunities for some sort of next life, I think is important. Equally important is, we've got to stop the flow. We've got to prevent the plastics from getting into the ocean in the first place. And but we're working on the cleanup side, and we're really focused on that. As you might expect, we see a lot of polyolefins or polyethylene and polypropylene. They're typically lighter than water, so they float naturally. But we also see PET and PVC and other heavier resins where they've entrapped air. A lot of people put their bottle caps back on a PET bottle so they'll float, which gives us a better chance of collecting them. But they are there, and I would say, in general, I would say there's what we see is maybe 50 or 60% nets and lines, that type of gear, and then the balance of material as rigid plastics, anything from containers to trawl floats and things like that.
I can't tell you how many times on a beach you find a piece of plastic that's been gnawed on, munched on by something. I say, if you're looking at a bucket and it has a puncture hole in it, or a gas can more often, or a bottle of detergent, and sometimes you see triangular marks that I presume is from a sea turtle. I'm not all that good at tracing what a bite mark looks like, but these plastics spend a long time at sea before they wind up in Alaska, so it doesn't necessarily mean it's a species I'm familiar with. But they do show up being bitten and chewed, and I've been in Katmai National Park and watched a bear chewing on plastic like it was a toy. But ingestion is primarily a threat to, it's a well-established threat to seabirds, less well-established to mammals, both marine and animals that we don't necessarily think of as marine mammals, like coastal brown bear. Entanglement is another one, and so entanglement is, it can be birds. I don't see that as often locally, but I have seen seabirds with their feet caught in a sort of a monofilament mesh. More often, it's an entanglement of larger marine mammals with nets and ropes and things like that, anything from whales to seals. Several times I've seen sea lions with banding straps around their necks. And they get to the point, they even grow into it. They never can shed it, and they'll grow to the point where it's starting to abrade their neck, and they eventually die from it. There's no way for a rescue agency, there's no approved way for agencies to rescue a stellar sea lion using darts or anything like that. They're just too big and dangerous. So those animals are doomed. Whales are an entanglement issue. A friend of mine, biologist and I don't say friend of mine, but a colleague in Hawaii, tracks humpback whales that are coming to the Hawaiian breeding grounds, and he told me he could count 20 of them in his memory that showed up wearing Alaska fishing gear, like wearing a piece of line connected to a crab pot buoy or something that had marks on it from Alaska. So they towed that thing 1,500 miles to Hawaii, from Alaska to Hawaii, which obviously is a tough experience for them and bad for their health. And then the human impact, once it gets down to a molecular level and ends up in our tissues, that's the newest field that's emerging of what the impact of plastics are to us. So it's all bad, and it just makes the job we're doing, I think, all the more important.